You Jude St. Francis. You are my oldest, dearest friend. You're the son of Harold Stein and Julia Altman. You're the friend of Malcolm Irvine, of Jean-Baptiste Marion, of Andy Contractor. You're a New Yorker. You live in Soho. You volunteer for an arts organization.
That's enough of that. If you're watching this video, chances are you've heard of A Little Life, 2015's hottest, heaviest hit by American author Hanya Yanagihara. For those of you who haven't heard of it, A Little Life is the Lifetime original Hallmark movie about trauma. It's 720 pages long, and approximately all of them feature scenes of graphic abuse. But A Little Life is a book with meaning. I got gifted this copy for Christmas, and was a ways into it before I realised what that meaning was. The more I read, the more I researched, the more angry I got. Yanagihara has some pretty strong views, most notably about mental health-based euthanasia, and through an interesting use of pulpy fan-fiction techniques and tropes, she's managed to package these views into a bestseller. Combine this with the book's popularity, and Yanagihara openly admitting her lack of research or experience with the subject matter, and you can see why this book has me worried. Before we get going though, not everyone has the time to chew on this brick of a book. Some people enjoy talking to friends or leaving the house. So let's briefly go over the plot, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll drop a content warning here for everything now appearing on screen. I won't go into too much detail, but the book does deal with some pretty heavy stuff. Part 1, the story. A Little Life starts in New York City. You are the most devious bastard in all of New York City. Yes, I can hear you, Clem Fandango. A Little Life starts in New York City and follows 4 men. Malcolm, an aspiring architect and son of rich parents. JB, an aspiring painter and son of semi-rich parents. Willem, an aspiring actor and the son of dirt farmers. And Jude St. Francis. The first 80 pages are dedicated to the facade that this book will be about the 4 of them growing older through life's twists and turns, united by their bond. As such, we get a slice of life centered around each of them. Malcolm gets the least page time and is the least distinct. He has parents with fuck you money, and that's about all we get. Willem is more pivotal. While working as a waiter, he's doing everything he can to make it big as an actor, but he can't imagine the success that awaits him. He doesn't just make it doing voiceovers, he doesn't just make it in a few supporting roles, he ends up being an international movie star, beloved the world over. His film shoots take him all over the world, he makes millions, has multiple affairs with attractive women, has his face plastered on billboards all over New York. This is not a book that does half measures. JB, the painter, is the most interesting of the 4. He starts the book with some actual conflict, full of ambition and love for his friends, but with a malicious streak that makes him lash out. He comes from a relatively wealthy background, but wants to pursue an artistic career and feels almost guilty that he hasn't suffered more, which makes him an interesting addition to a book about trauma. Jude is a public litigator. It's clear from the get-go that he's got a mysterious past, and this intrigue helps get things going at the beginning. He walks with a limp, though none of his friends know why, and he's oddly reticent on his origins. First impressions were good. The setup had some potential for some really interesting dynamics moving forward. The ambition, the competition, the caring, the uncertainty, the differences in their upbringing, it was all very intriguing. I was ready to love this book. But then we come to that 80-page mark. This is where we discover the true focus of the story, Jude and his past, which we'll get to in a second. Malcolm all but vanishes from the story, only to be name-checked occasionally as his career takes off and he becomes the best gosh darn architect in the world, despite his debilitating Nepo connections. JB lasts a little longer and even has some scenes later in the book, but in a character shift as smooth and natural as a leg amputation, spoiler warning, JB decides to mock Jude's limp. I wasn't clear on why he did this, but it results in a falling out, and he's pretty much a non-factor for the rest of the story. Remarkably, despite everyone else's outrage, Jude himself takes the insult with grace and humility. He understood that JB was going through a lot. He can no more hold it against him than he can begrudge the rain for falling. Yanagihara has said this isn't a book about trauma, but about male friendship. She has stated she chose men because they are culturally discouraged from sharing their emotions, that they have a more limited palette to work with, and this is what interests her. So, she claims, the focus is less on Jude's trauma and more about the four men and their bond. But saying as much isn't enough to make it so. For starters, it's interesting that a book ostensibly about male friendship should start with those friendships already made. No time whatsoever is given to how exactly this unique bond formed. Then, after the promising start, the element of friendship is reduced down to only Jude and Willem. It's here we stay for the remainder of the book, most of the 720 pages. So, we finally arrive at the meat of the story, which is, put bluntly, Jude's suffering. It starts with Willem waking up to find Jude, with whom he shares an apartment, asking to be driven to the hospital, with his arm wrapped in a towel dripping with blood. This is that 80-page mark event that drags the attention off the four men and onto Jude alone. We discover that Jude cuts himself. The description is not so coy for the remainder of the book, however. Soon, we're shown many explicit scenes of self-harm in a variety of ways. If the book can be said to have a core, it's the alternating scenes of Jude's traumatic past and his present-day self-harm. But what about Jude as a character? Good question. Despite what we deduce as a difficult past, Jude is unbelievably accomplished. As in, I don't believe it. He's an accomplished pure mathematician, top of his class at law school and later a world-class litigator, a talented singer and piano player, a top swimmer, a fantastic home baker and gourmand, a skilled chess player, and, on top of all that, wildly attractive. The only thing Jude is ever bad at, outside of his emotional difficulties, is dancing. It's worth mentioning that we never see Jude develop these skills or even show much of a desire to. He rolled off the production line pre-baked, pre-skilled, predestined to succeed. But a person is more than just a sum of their traumas and their talents. What's Jude's character like? What does he do for fun? What kind of jokes does he tell? Who does he think should have won Love Island Series 8? The book's answer to all this is... Oh, God. I understand that Jude's trauma is central to his character. It's his defining feature. But is there anything else? Is he even capable of feeling happiness? Not according to Yanagihara.
Did you set out to have him try to find happiness?
I think he had it taken out of him, the capacity for happiness. For sustained happiness.
As such, in the few scenes with Jude that aren't directly related to his traumatic past or self-harm in the present, he's pretty inconsistent. One scene he's cracking jokes with his underlings at the firm, the next he's shy and timid, the next he's a brash, stone-cold lawyer. You could argue this makes him multifaceted and complex, but without a core personality unique to him, it made him only exist as a vague bucket of trauma and cliché. It's around this time we're introduced to Harold, Jude's law professor and soon adoptive father. Harold is Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird. I'd qualify that in some way, but that's the long and short of it. He's a sober lawyer, father figure, moral compass, virtuous and pure. Harold is a deeply cathartic character. He's the father Jude never had. He never mistreats him, never misuses his power, never for an instant doubts his love for Jude. Like Atticus Finch, Harold doesn't have a wife. Instead, he has a sort of gaseous entity that sometimes floats around him, called Julia, his second wife only by name. She never exists in a scene without him. She has no interests, personality, motivations, or opinions. You could cut her out of the book entirely without having to alter a single scene she's not in. After Harold adopts Jude, things get a bit potato salad-y structure-wise. The scenes alternate between three subjects: Jude and Willem in the modern day, becoming ever richer and more famous, Jude self-harming by cutting himself with razor blades, and Jude's backstory. Let's do the modern day first so I can put off talking about his past. Jude leaves his job at the Justice Department and starts working in private law, much to the horror of his arty friends. He moves into a lavish apartment, something in Manhattan, tasteful, stylish. This is the book for you if you love hearing about rich people decorating apartments and American Psycho just isn't cutting it for you. Willem lands his first big film role and starts to get recognised on the street. Before long, he's away for months at a time, filming all over the world, though him and Jude stay close by calling every day. Malcolm, the fourth member of this tight-knit friend group, is off somewhere, doing something, I think, for sure. The next event of any significance, around the 300-page mark, is the introduction of Caleb Porter, an attractive fashion designer type who takes a shine to Jude. After only a few meetings, Caleb makes an advance, and soon they're in a relationship. Quickly, however, this becomes an abusive relationship. Jude seems to feel comforted by Caleb's derision, as it confirms his view of himself. Caleb hates Jude's disability, his legs often hurt so much that he has to use a wheelchair, and is repulsed by the scars all over Jude's body. Matters come to a head when Caleb attacks Jude so viciously that Jude ends up in hospital. None of this is off-page, by the way. It's all very front and centre. Kind of hard to make jokes about this one. It's just depressing. Abuse. The whole episode, from first meeting to hospitalization, lasts less than 50 pages, but the effect on Jude is immense. Despite the support and love from everyone in his life, he spirals down and down until exactly a year after his hospitalization, he attempts to take his own life. He's foiled at the last moment because he misjudged when a friend would come over. The suicide attempt was a turning point in the book for me. The weight of Jude's past and new abuse was upsetting, but nothing that made me want to stop reading. It was here, however, when Jude's suicide attempt is described in detail, that made me stop sympathising with the goals of the narrative. Was it necessary that we understand the best way to... that we know the best implement to use and how to avoid failure? What does the reader gain from this suicide instruction walkthrough? The explicit detail used in the abuse scenes at least can be justified along the lines of understanding what he went through, but that doesn't track so well here. Jude recovers in hospital and eventually goes home, though watched closely by his friends. Willem, the one that matters, decides to stay in New York for a while and ends up moving in with Jude. In another character shift as natural as another leg amputation, double spoiler warning, Willem develops feelings for Jude. This tentatively blossoms into a relationship. This part was a highlight for me. Ignore the fact that Willem had never shown any romantic interest in Jude up until this point. I thought it was handled well. The whole idea of two people who care deeply about one another but don't feel like their relationship fits any of the traditional labels, that worked for me. I liked seeing the two of them build their own kind of relationship, constantly feeling for the boundaries of what they and their partner wanted. It's not a dynamic I've seen much of in contemporary mainstream fiction, and I was happy to see it. Then Jude gets both his legs amputated, and Willem dies in a car crash. It's that abrupt too. It's not like Willem had a history of drunk driving, and Jude was always warning him not to do sick handbrake turns next to the edge of canyons. Nope. Willem gets T-boned by a drunk driver, and that's all there is to it. Well, I guess Malcolm and his wife die in the car as well, for whatever that's worth. I've spoken to people who were with the book up until this moment. It's the point at which Jude's suffering crosses the line from plausible into contrived. I can understand that a child who only knows abuse would end up being abused by multiple people. I can understand that such a person might be more likely when they grow up to end up in abusive relationships. I can understand the kind of suffering that this kind of trauma would cause years or decades down the line, but the hand of God reaching in to kill that guy's loving partner, now I'm starting to think he's cursed. So what about Jude's fateful past? This is where things get extra dark, so if that's not your bag, feel free to skip forward to the next section. He was abandoned as a baby next to or inside a dumpster, then taken in by a group of monks. I think the collective noun is a haunting of monks. Several of the monks sexually and physically abuse him while at the monastery. Jude grows close with one monk, Brother Luke, who promises Jude that if they ran away together, they could build themselves a cabin in the woods where they could grow their own food and live happily. Brother Luke then abducts Jude. Over the next several years, the two drive all over the West, stopping in motels where Brother Luke pimps him out to strangers. Brother Luke also abuses Jude, claiming that they are in love. The stories and promises Brother Luke told him at the monastery quickly fall apart and Jude loses hope. When Jude is around 14, One of the motels they're staying at gets raided by the police, and Jude is taken away. He then goes to a home where the counsellors also sexually and physically abuse him. Eventually, he succeeds in running away and makes his way east by having sex with truck drivers in exchange for money, food, and transport. I had no idea that every truck driver in the American West is a paedophile. On his journey, however, Jude contracts a venereal disease, falls sick, and passes out in public, only to wake up in the home prison of one Dr. Traylor. Dr. Traylor keeps Jude locked in his basement and nurses him back to health with food and antibiotics. After Jude is well again, the sexual abuse starts. His eventual escape from Dr. Traylor comes when Traylor, for some reason, decides to let him go, though not before he makes him run out into a field where he hits him with his car. This is the source of Jude's limp and eventual leg amputations. Only after all that does Jude wake up in hospital with a social worker who doesn't want to sexually assault him, a kind woman named Anna. Anna is one of the few people Jude ever really trusts, so of course she quickly dies of cancer. I hope that seeing all of these events laid out in a continuous series will illustrate how improbably awful Jude's backstory is. Since it's parceled out in flashbacks over the 720 pages, it doesn't hit you just how, dare I say, cartoonishly fucked up it is. It becomes hard to take seriously after a while. Like, Yanagihara asked herself at every juncture, what is the most upsetting thing that could happen? Like, the most depressing game of consequences ever played. The main story then ends as you probably expected. Jude is forced into therapy that has no effect, then takes his own life, leaving Harold the last man standing. The end of the book is told from his point of view, talking to Willem's grave. And that's the whole story. I've got my issues with the way the story is told, about the indistinctness of the dialogue, the style, the lack of a definite time period, and so on, but that's not relevant. What's more important is that now you know how dark the story gets, you can understand just how strange the reception has been. A Little Life is nothing if not contentious. Part 2, The Reception. More than any book I can think of, more than any modern piece of art, this book divided critics. Out of 10 reviews from the heavy hitters, that is, 3 from The Guardian, 2 from The New Yorker, 2 from Vox, and 1 each from The Evening Standard, The New York Times, and The New York Review of Books, 6 were overwhelmingly positive. And I mean overwhelmingly. One from The New Yorker said, quote, Martin Amis once asked, who else but Tolstoy has made happiness really swing on the page? And the surprising answer is that Hanya Yanagihara has. Praise doesn't come much higher than that. The rest of the reviews were more mixed, if not outright critical. The New York Times review by Carol Anshaw had lots of positive things to say, but also ended with the pretty damning lines, quote, Yanagihara's success in creating a deeply afflicted protagonist is offset by placing him in a world so unrealized it almost seems allegorical. With characters so flatly drawn, they seem more representative of people than the actual thing. This leaves the reader, at the end, wondering if she has been foolish for taking seriously something that was merely a contrivance all along. Even some of the reviews that praised the book overall had major issues, mainly with the style. Bridget Delaney, writing in The Guardian, called the book a modern classic, but conceded that the prose was a little patchy. There were only 2 reviews that crossed the line from critical to outright hatred, and both are worth a look. The first is an article from Vox by Constance Grady. Funnily enough, the other Vox article, written by Jeff Chu, is one of the overwhelmingly positive ones. I wonder if the 2 writers ever lock eyes across the office and frown. Grady is mostly critical of the book's self-indulgence, Yanagihara's tendency to wallow in her character's suffering, but she also takes issue with the more fanciful, juvenile elements of the story. She writes, quote, the fantasy of Yanagihara's books is, what if I were beautiful and talented, and I suffered more than any other human being had suffered? Would this make me interesting? Would this make me lovable? Would all my enemies be hated and all my friends angelic? We'll come back to this idea a bit later on. Most critical of all the reviews by far was from the December 2015 New York Review of Books by Daniel Mendelsohn. He pulled no punches. He called the writing, quote, often atrocious, strained and ungainly, and incoherently ungrammatical. He wondered, quote, why the striking weakness of the prose had gone unremarked by critics and prize juries. He also responds to a well-known review from The Atlantic by Garth Greenwell, who called A Little Life the great gay novel. Mendelssohn, himself a gay man, comments on how strange this is, considering the novel really doesn't engage with any of the common experiences of modern metropolitan gay men. Difficulties dating, worries about AIDS, homophobia, the rise of dating apps, none of it. It's also strange, Mendelssohn notes, considering that this is the second of Yanagihara's works to conflate male-male relationships with histories of paedophilic abuse. Mendelssohn's article is, I think, overly critical and loses me at the end with his speculation on why he thinks A Little Life has appealed to younger readers, saying, young people are increasingly encouraged to see themselves not as agents in life, but as potential victims. In his view, the novel confirms, quote, their pre-existing view of the world as a site of victimization. Mendelssohn doesn't do himself any favours with this unfounded conjecture, and makes himself look like a stick-waving old man ranting about how soft these snowflake kids are nowadays. Regardless, the article gained some traction. Many later reviews make references to it. Is it possible that Yanagihara read it herself? I'll do you one better. In a 2022 article for The New Yorker, staff writer D.T. Max asked Yanagihara about the article. Max writes, quote, one evening, I delicately brought up Mendelssohn's essay. When Yanagihara flinched, I remembered she had told me that she didn't read reviews. I don't think much of Daniel Mendelssohn, she said sharply after a pause. I hate his writing. Make of that what you will. Every fucking time I film, I cover myself in coffee. Why? I didn't even tip it that time. It just kind of... Just like on Rotten Tomatoes, the audience reaction seems to be miles away from that of the critics. A Little Life has been popular online since it came out, but its popularity really exploded on BookTok in mid-2023. It is far above my pay grade to speculate on why this might have happened, almost a decade after the book came out. Yanagihara's third novel, To Paradise, came out in 2022, and seems to have gone largely unnoticed on social media, or at least when compared with the reaction A Little Life received. And what was that reaction like exactly?
Why would you write this? I can't do this shit.
I'd call that positive, in a way.
I did not cry, and in fact, my first reader didn't cry at all, and my agent didn't cry, and my editor didn't cry. So when people started crying, I thought, wow, what a bunch of pussies, you know?
I want to point out, I'm not trying to make fun of any of the people I featured. There's nothing wrong with being moved by a book. I'm simply trying to illustrate that, despite what some critics might say, despite the dark subject matter, despite the length, this book still managed to become wildly popular among young people. It gave them something they couldn't find anywhere else. Young readers found this book, and they connected deeply with it. Why is that? Part 3. Fan fiction. All the while I read A Little Life, I was haunted by one question. It floated up when the main character turned out to be talented at everything, when the pure hero suffered more than any person ever had, when the two pretty male characters got together out of nowhere. And it was this. Why the hell does it feel like I'm reading fan fiction? Let me put a quick disclaimer here. I'm not a member of any of the fan fiction communities I'll be talking about. The only fan fiction I've ever written, I've kept to myself. I'll have sources on screen and in the description. For those of you who have just found the internet, welcome. Pull up a chair. Get cozy. Never Google image search anything to do with Sonic the Hedgehog. Fanfiction is a genre of fiction that uses pre-existing characters or settings in a new story, not officially connected to the existing work. The work might be a TV show, a movie, a game, a novel, a song, anything. There even exists a subgenre of fanfiction called real person fiction, or RPF, that uses real people as characters. Like any genre of fiction, it can be hard to pin down exactly what is and isn't fanfiction. Some people might argue that RPF isn't technically fanfiction, or that all fictionalized accounts are really fanfiction. Some might go down the structuralist route and define fanfiction strictly by some fundamental characteristics, like I did earlier by saying it had to use pre-existing characters. Some might go for a more intuitive definition based on the culture and tropes that have arisen in the last 50-odd years. Regardless of exactly where you draw the boundaries, fanfiction is not without its many tropes, its many subgenres, and its many sub-subgenres. The line between trope, subgenre, fandom, and tag can be blurry. When does a trope start to define its own subgenre? There's alternate universe, fluff, ABO, WWE, Dead Dove, NASCAR, enemies to lovers, crack, and a popular subgenre of country humans involving personifications of Cold War-era America and Russia. There's one genre in particular I want to talk about, and that's Hurt Comfort. According to fanlore.org, Hurt Comfort is one of the earliest genres of modern fanfiction, growing, as so many genres did, out of the work of the communities surrounding Star Trek, the original series. At first, the works were called Get stories, as in Get Spock, Get Kirk, and these tended to lean on the hurt side of Hurt Comfort. As the genre grew and matured, it birthed subgenres and mingled with others, such as torture, BDSM, angst, and snifflefic, a modern subgenre that's light on the hurt and more about cozy comfort. But it's a modern variation of this genre that I want to focus on, and that's called Wump. I saw it also referred to as Bonk and Owies in some places, though these names don't seem to be widespread. Either way, fanfiction writers really know how to name a genre. What do you got there? A nice bit of detective fiction? Oh, that's good. Oh, me? No, I'm just reading some bonk. Wump, as the name suggests, is a form of hurt comfort which features a character suffering through physical or emotional pain to extreme levels. Sometimes the suffering is paid off with eventual or partial comfort, sometimes not. Common features of this genre include sexual assault, torture, brain damage, neurological disease, and, unsurprisingly, given all of that, suicide. The Wumpies in these stories tend to be beloved characters, since the enjoyment, or rather the catharsis, comes from seeing someone you care about suffer, but in a detached, consequence-free environment. Suffering beautifully is a term used to describe this kind of suffering, the idealized character nobly bearing the weight of their pain. The comfort element of these stories, if there is one, is often used as a way of progressing a romantic relationship, especially in same-sex relationships, where there's an element of taboo that might prevent the characters from expressing desire. Extreme suffering can narratively help them to open up and rely on one another, and so grow closer. So, can we draw some parallels between this genre of fanfiction and A Little Life? Jude certainly does suffer to an extraordinary degree, more than most people could imagine a person to suffer. This, combined with his constant purity of intent, his amazing talent and intelligence, and his good looks, certainly position him as the protagonist of a classic hurt comfort wump story. It fits even better when we remember that final act car crash. Car crash in the literal sense, not the metaphorical. After all his suffering, after everything he went through, Yanagihara's enjoyment with these characters clearly comes from Jude's continued suffering, even at the expense of credibility. Even in the world of the story, the other characters seem to understand that Jude's suffering is the only experience that matters. Jude's friend/doctor, Andy, who exists mainly as a plot device to explain how Jude can get medical treatment without getting sectioned, at one point gets angry at Jude's friends because they aren't taking proper care of him. Jude cut himself, Andy seems to say, because his friends aren't there to stop him. Instead of his friends responding by saying, Jude is an adult, I'm his friend, not his parent, I have other things going on in my life, they instead concede that they have to do a better job. All the characters in the novel fall on one side of the good-bad dichotomy, and if a character falls on the good side, then they have no care as meaningful as comforting Jude, If they fall on the bad side, they have no desire stronger than to hurt him. JB, the painter, is the only character who defies this convention to an extent, and it's what makes him the most interesting character in the novel. If only we were treated to more than one three-dimensional character. Then there's Willem, and I don't want to be reductive. I know there are many and varied types of fanfiction, but a very popular type of fanfiction involves contrived male-male romances, such as the kind that appears between Jude and Willem. It's Wincest, it's Kirk Spock, it's John Locke. Throughout the story, neither Jude or Willem ever identify as gay. Even after he and Jude start dating, Willem insists, quote, "I'm not in a relationship with a man, I'm in a relationship with Jude." Aside from whether this is a good or fair representation of gay relationships, it highlights just how improbable, even in the world of the story, their getting together is. Now, a novel sharing many of the same hallmarks as a genre of fanfiction isn't a problem in and of itself. I'm mentioning it here not to denigrate it by comparing it to a type of fiction that people often dismiss as low effort, but to contextualize it. In the last few months, when people have asked what I'm reading, I've told them about A Little Life. It's 720 pages, I say, and extremely graphic, dealing with some very heavy topics. I also mention that it's very popular among young people, particularly on social media apps like TikTok. The response I've gotten is, why? Why are young people reading such a depressing tome? It goes against all logic that says young people want shorter, lighter books. Its success has seemingly come out of nowhere. By drawing parallels between a very popular genre of fanfiction and A Little Life, we can explain where some of that popularity has come from. It does have a precedent, just not in mainstream literature. It also helps explain why a book that involves so much trauma and abuse and self-harm can feel like it's saying nothing, for most of the book at least. We'll come back to that. It's a novel wearing the guise of literature, of high culture, but the real focus is on pulpy entertainment. Part of the confusion as to the popularity of A Little Life, I think, comes from literary correspondents being unfamiliar with the popularity of hurt comfort fanfiction online. Yes, a story can be fun and pulpy while featuring horrific scenes of abuse. Such concoction, it turns out, can also be wildly popular. But all this begs the question, if A Little Life is about enjoyment, if the reader is meant to take a sort of pleasure from Jude's suffering, and if this is Yanagihara's second book of her 3, all of which heavily feature the sexual abuse of gay men, then you have to ask, isn't that kind of fucked up? Part 4. Who can write what? In a 2022 interview, Guardian reporter Claire Armistead asked Yanagihara how she felt about the #OwnVoice movement. Quote, "I have the right to write about whatever I want. The only thing a reader can judge is whether I have done so well or not." Here she is being interviewed by Dua Lipa, saying much the same.
And I'd love to know how you stay faithful and honest to experiences that aren't your own.
You know, as a creator, you have to be able to inhabit other people's voices and other people's experiences. We published, I'm the editor-in-chief of a magazine called T, which is the New York Times' style and design magazine. And we published an interview in December with the American playwright Tony Kushner. And he said something that really resonated with me, which was, he said, "I refuse to accept this notion that I am causing harm to another community by writing in their voice."
This is a pretty bold stance. One I think deserves careful consideration. I'm a young bisexual man. I live in a city. I have male friends. No, please go back. That can't be the take. But I don't have a history of abuse. I'm not from New York. I'm not a person of colour. I don't know about the true experiences of people like those portrayed in the book. And as such, I can't judge how accurately such experiences are portrayed. To a large extent, I agree with Yanagihara. I think writing any fiction outside of the purely autobiographical involves projecting yourself into the mind of another to some degree. You're constantly wearing the skin of others, and those others might be very different to you, not just in terms of race, sexuality, and gender, but also age, nationality, profession, and 1,000 other small identities that define a person. I don't think a straight person should be disparaged from writing from the point of view of a gay person any more than I think a gay person can't write through the eyes of a straight person. In theory, There are three large and prickly caveats to this. Firstly, it's naive of me to equate a queer person writing from the point of view of a straight cis person with the reverse. Ignoring how successful an author is, you have to consider the larger cultures. What lots of people dislike about writers writing outside their identities, I think, comes less from how good the work might be, and more from the history of certain groups being kept out of publishing. What you're doing, people may say, is sucking up the air, filling up the stage, making less room for people from those backgrounds to tell their own stories. People don't want another story about suffering gay men, the publisher says, before declining to purchase the new novel from someone trying to tell their own story. Of course, there are exceptions and nuances to this generalization, but this is the most basic form of the argument. Secondly, no matter where you fall on the core of the identity and publishing debate, I think we can all agree that when an author writes about members of a marginalised group, one they aren't a part of, consistently over several books, each of which feature those members suffering in extreme ways, you have to start asking questions. What is it about this group in particular suffering horribly that so interests the author? All three of Yanagihara's books to date feature male-male sexual abuse. Her 2022 novel, To Paradise, is told over 3 time periods, 1893, 1993, and 2093. But she made up a fantasy version of 1893 New York, where gay relationships are legal, seemingly just to be able to continue writing about gay men even when writing historical fiction. Without fail, the gay men she depicts are attractive, pure, and suffering horribly. Yanagihara sits as the editor of the New York Times style magazine T. A 2018 issue of T was dedicated to people lost during the AIDS crisis, and featured a number of recreations of what those people would look like today. Naturally, all were looking slim and stylish. The response to this issue was mixed, according to a 2022 article by The New Yorker, with some feeling it had, quote, aestheticized the time of pain. One of those mentioned in the issue, though not recreated, was photographer Peter Hujar, who died in 1987 from AIDS-related complications. Peter Hujar is the man who took this famous photo. It's from 1969 and called Orgasmic Man, as it features a man coming. Yanagihara describes in a 2016 Politics and Prose interview that she personally insisted on this picture for the cover. I'm not saying it isn't a compelling image, it is, but it's interesting how she seems always drawn to this idea of gay men in pleasure, gay men in pain. Thirdly, there's the matter of veracity. I mentioned above that authors are constantly projecting themselves into other minds, and this is true, but I believe the core emotion of the story should be drawn from one's own experience, if the work is to be truly great. The scaffolding, what your protagonist does for work, what bars they go to, all that, in my opinion, doesn't need to hit the same standard of truthfulness as all the emotional elements. Purely from a technical standpoint, from a how good is the book point of view, the emotional bits, that's the stuff that should be drawn from your own life. You can write about space cadets battling aliens or 6th century queens navigating political intrigue, but if the core of friendship or anxiety or grief are drawn from your own life, then the book will resonate with the reader. Then there's the matter of factual accuracy. Bear with me on this, because we're going to talk about maths. Let's go! Can I get a... Throughout the book, Jude's inner monologue references something called the axiom of equality, something he's familiar with from his time excelling in the field of pure maths and logic. It is, he claims, a fundamental precept of maths, something that cannot be proven, only assumed true, that states, for all mathematical objects x is always equal to x. He uses this to explain to himself why he cannot change, even as his life changes around him. He will always be the same because he is always equal to himself. Nice little metaphor, connecting one of Jude's many talents to his emotional struggles. I think it's fair to say that most readers would never question the axiom of equality. It's convincing enough. Unless you have a background in maths, it won't stick out as strange. Unfortunately, I do have a background in maths, and it did stick out as strange. Double unfortunately. My specialty back in my maths-doing days was pure maths, logic, and set theory. Bluntly, there is no such thing as the axiom of equality. Within the standard axiomatic framework that mathematicians use nowadays, something called ZF set theory, the closest thing to this axiom of equality is something called the axiom of extensionality. Without getting too technical, it states something much stronger than x is always equal to x, and it introduces some fundamental concepts of set theory in the process, which is worth a look if you're interested. I'll link a great description video down below. Why does that matter? Really, who gives a shit if the maths Yanagihara presents in the book is wrong? Nobody. I knew it was wrong and I didn't care. I didn't expect a full breakdown of set membership and how that relates to Jude's past. The only reason I'm bringing it up is to illustrate that when it comes to writing outside of your experience, good enough usually means missing out a lot of the nuance and interesting perspective you get if you read the same story by someone who, frankly, knew what the fuck they were talking about. Like I said, I don't have a history of abuse. I can't comment on how well Yanagihara depicted people with such a background. She stated outright in interviews that she did no research into what life was like for survivors of abuse. Talking to people in my life who do relate to a fraction of Jude's experience, the consensus seems to be that good enough was the goal. She hit the mark in some ways and missed it in others. So, if you're like me, and haven't struggled with any of the issues discussed in the novel, you might feel like you're gaining perspective on the subject of life after trauma. You're convinced you're learning about the experience of others when really you're not. Much like with the axiom of equality, good enough misses out on the nuance of the truth. When it comes to maths, that doesn't really matter. But when it comes to people, to the experiences of a group that you're not a part of, what does that mean when the reading public feels like they're getting the full picture, but what they're really getting is an oversimplified cartoon version, a version that's good enough? But the criticism directed at A Little Life isn't just because Yanagihara is the one who wrote it. If I'm being honest, I doubt whether the issue would be so talked about if the book was better written. It's American Dirt all over again. There's another aspect to this discussion of exploitation that's less about who wrote it and more about how the book tries to engage the reader. Engage the reader. Oh my god, they're engaging us! Oh no, the gays, they're trying to kill me. Tries to engage the reader. It's what people mean when they point at A Little Life and say, this is trauma porn. Part 5. What is trauma porn? I've seen the term trauma porn thrown around in connection with this book, sometimes concedingly, sometimes denying, sometimes accusing. It quickly stuck out to me that each person using this term, in whatever capacity, had subtly different definitions of what it meant. Some people use it interchangeably with terms like exploitative. Some pointed to the specific detail of the story as evidence, some to the sexuality of the characters. So first, I'd like to discuss what I mean when I say trauma porn, before I discuss whether or not I think A Little Life meets that definition. Let's ask the obvious question: what is pornography, in the traditional sense? In the God-fearing sense. It's tempting to fall back on the old I know it when I see it definition from a 1964 ruling by the US Supreme Court, but as people way more qualified than me have pointed out, this is pretty arbitrary as definitions go. Who's to say whether my idea of pornography is the same as yours? Maybe I thought that grave sex scene in Saltburn was porn of the hardest core. This is still an issue today, one that social media companies have to deal with on a daily basis. In my last video, I was concerned I'd get flagged on YouTube for posting this cover of Marian Engel's book, Bear. That's a topless woman if I ever saw one, so wouldn't that violate YouTube's whole no nudity thing? I went to YouTube's community guidelines and found the following. Explicit content meant to be sexually gratifying is not allowed on YouTube. Don't post content on YouTube if it shows 1. The depiction of clothed or unclothed genitals, breasts, or buttocks that are meant for sexual gratification. 2. Pornography, the depiction of sexual acts or fetishes that are meant for sexual gratification. Effectively, this is YouTube defining porn by the supposed intention of the author. It doesn't make any judgments along the lines of, if you show a penis, then it's automatically porn, but makes a more general qualification to do with what the work is meant to do. It centers around whether the piece is meant for sexual gratification. During the Super Bowl halftime show in February of 2004, the headline act, Janet Jackson, was joined by surprise guest Justin Timberlake for a rendition of Rock Your Body. After the final line of the song, Timberlake tore at Jackson's outfit, exposing her. It's still unclear how much of this was intentional, if any, but regardless, the fallout was catastrophic. Jackson took the brunt of the blame, and it effectively ruined her career. The event marks a major turning point in the history of US censorship, and for black women in mainstream music. Here is a picture of that famous moment. I can show you that image on YouTube because of the context I've set up surrounding it, classifying it as what YouTube calls educational, documentary, scientific, and artistic, or EDSA, content. It's clear to a reasonable viewer that I don't intend for this image to inspire sexual gratification. It's an important piece of history, and I'm using the image to illustrate that. If I was instead making a video called, say, Top 10 Sexiest Nipple Slips to Jerk Off To, then it would be clear that I do intend for this image to be sexually gratifying. But most pieces of media are more ambiguous. Can you call something porn if only a part of it is clearly meant to be sexually gratifying? Consider the film The Wolf of Wall Street. In one scene, Margot Robbie's character punishes Leonardo DiCaprio's character by leveraging his attraction to her.
It's gonna be nothing but short skirts around the house.
Yeah?
Yeah. But no touching.
Or consider the film Magic Mike, where Channing Tatum's character strips on stage. It's pretty clear, or if you disagree, at least reasonable to say, that these scenes are meant to inspire sexual feelings in the viewer. They have to, from the point of view of the filmmaker. The viewer needs to be sold on the sexual attraction of the characters so that the story can function. Even if you personally aren't hot and bothered by Margot Robbie in short skirts or Channing Tatum in a snapback, you understand that these scenes are meant to be sexy. If you didn't, then the plots wouldn't make any sense. Why are all these women cheering about this guy getting undressed on stage? Is this some kind of film about competitive undressing? But neither The Wolf of Wall Street nor Magic Mike are called porn films. They contain scenes that are meant to inspire sexual feeling, but that's not the point of the film. The sexual feelings are used to make a larger point about the characters or about the story. In The Wolf of Wall Street, it's used to illustrate Margot Robbie's character's attempts to assert some control over her licentious husband. In Magic Mike, it's about establishing the attractive world of male stripping and Channing Tatum's character within that. By contrast, consider a pornographic film which includes only 5% of actual sexual content and 95% preamble. There's 55 minutes of the pizza guy driving, of the customer letting him in, making sausage pizza innuendos, pouring him a drink, discussing how they both recently got broken up with and want to get back at their exes. Then finally, there's only 5 minutes of them going to town. Despite the film having a similar composition of sexual and non-sexual scenes as The Wolf of Wall Street or Magic Mike, nobody's going to nominate it for an Oscar because it's clear to the reasonable viewer that the film as a whole is predominantly meant to inspire sexual gratification. In the pornographic film, all the other stuff is only there to support, contextualize, and thereby enhance the sexual kick the viewer is meant to experience from the film as a whole. Though they have a similar makeup of sexual scenes to non-sexual scenes, in a movie, the sex is there ultimately to help inspire some other emotion, and in the porn movie, the other emotions are there to help inspire the sexual emotion. So, in order to call something pornography, it needs to not only include a part that is meant to be sexually gratifying, but the surrounding work needs to support that feeling rather than be supported by it. I'll call this classification system porn by structure. Crucially, using this classification, we don't need the author's intentions as a prerequisite for determining whether or not something is porn. There's still ambiguity, because people may disagree on what the average viewer would think inspires sexual feeling, and to what extent the surrounding context supports those feelings, but we've cut the author out of that equation. We don't have to make guesses about what the author intended, we can instead consider the final product on its own. So let's take this idea away from porn and start transitioning it over to the more modern idea of blank porn. Out there on the howling wastes of the internet, you may have seen many things referred to as blank porn. Food porn, city porn, mineral porn, earth porn, map porn, architecture porn. These are all large Reddit communities for sharing non-sexual content about their respective subjects. So why do people call it porn in the first place? Let's start with food porn. Here is a picture of a delicious meal I made the other day when I wanted junk food but I didn't want to leave the house. Here's some context I wrote about how I made it, what inspired it, and how it tasted. If I present this information as such, with the title My Amazing Meal, then it's pretty clear I'm in the world of food porn. There is context, but it's presented as secondary to the picture and only serves to contextualize and so enhance the enjoyment the viewer will get from the picture. However, the same picture with similar context presented like this as part of an article titled "A Clinical Study of Eating Your Feelings" with the caption "A delicious meal one might crave when depressed" is clearly not intended to be food porn. The picture is the same, the intended feelings of hunger and satisfaction are the same, the two settings even share a lot of the same context. Why is one food porn and the other not? Let's use our porn by structure framework. You feel the same mixture of hunger and satisfaction when you see the picture in both contexts, so the first test isn't enough to distinguish them. The second test, however, is more useful. In the food porn post, the context sets up the picture, and the picture is the final payoff. You finish interacting with the media with that feeling of satisfaction. That is the meaning of the piece, there is no higher purpose. In the academic article, however, the picture and the feeling it inspires are used to contextualize and enhance some larger point. The payoff of the piece doesn't arrive with the picture, but later. The piece does not exist to inspire that emotion of satisfaction, but instead uses it to inspire some other emotion, to convey another point. Of course, again, there is ambiguity. What the average viewer is meant to get out of any piece of media is vague at best, at worst, contentious. What does all this mean in the context of trauma porn? It's pretty clear what the expected emotion is when talking about porn or food porn, respectively, sexy and tasty. But why would anyone seek out descriptions of trauma? It's clear people do. Running a marathon, lifting weights, eating spicy food. These are all activities that are unpleasant on the face of it, and yet people engage in them repeatedly and willingly. Stories about deeply upsetting topics aren't less attractive to people because of their superficially upsetting subject matter. As many people have pointed out, part of the enjoyment of reading about trauma, of upsetting drama in general, is a kind of second-order happiness that comes out of emotional catharsis. When I use the term trauma porn, the expected reaction I'm referring to is this emotional catharsis. It's why you see people sobbing over A Little Life and yet come away satisfied and ready to recommend. Putting all of this together, I offer the following definition of trauma porn as it relates to stories. A story can be classified as trauma porn if a reasonable viewer would say it satisfies two conditions. 1. It involves human trauma or suffering that inspires feelings of distress, anguish, or sadness for the larger purpose of emotional catharsis. And 2. The remainder of the story exists solely to support, frame, contextualize, and thereby enhance these feelings. You might hear this and think, that's not too bad. There are loads of stories that involve suffering that are really all about giving the audience emotional catharsis. A gripping drama with characters you care about that leaves you in tears could, by this definition, be called trauma porn. And it's true, I don't think the term trauma porn needs to be any more derogatory than food porn. It's just a description of what the story can be expected to do. Calling something trauma porn means the story can be expected to give you emotional catharsis through depictions of suffering. I think the distaste for the term comes from its connotations of sexual sadist porn. When you hear the term trauma porn, you might think of the very different genre, sexual torture porn. Trauma porn has implications of hurting people for pleasure. A better term for what people commonly mean when they say trauma porn might be hardship porn, but even a term like that would likely get pushback from people who enjoy such stories, because calling something blank porn, as we've already discussed, implies that the whole piece exists only to support the viewer's enjoyment of that one thing. Food porn is only about looking at food. Porn is only about getting aroused. When you call something porn of any kind, you're saying that it aspires to no higher goal than inspiring one feeling, usually a simple primal feeling. You wouldn't call a weighty history book edification porn. The term trauma porn specifically seems to have picked up a few associated meanings as it's rolled through the internet. It comes with connotations of exploitation and malice. Aiming this term at Yanagihara's work especially, with her fascination with the trauma of young gay men, seems to come loaded with accusations. We'll address those accusations in a second, but for now, when I say trauma porn, I'm referring to the term only as I've defined it just now. So, let's apply our definition of trauma porn to A Little Life. 1. Does A Little Life include scenes of suffering or trauma that a reasonable viewer would think inspire distress for the wider purpose of emotional catharsis? Absolutely. I don't think there's any debate as to whether the scenes do or are even meant to make the reader upset for emotional catharsis. We've got bigger problems on our hands if Yanagihara wrote A Little Life thinking it wouldn't upset anyone.
What a bunch of pussies, you know?
2. Does the remainder of the story serve solely to support those feelings? Let's consider. What narrative purpose does, say, Caleb fulfill? What would be lost if he was cut out of the story? Well, his relationship with Jude precipitates a downturn in Jude's mental health. For the second half of the novel, Caleb's abuse serves as Jude's confirmation that his past isn't really past. That's certainly all about Jude's suffering. His abuse results in Harold, Jude's adoptive father, getting more involved in Jude's life. In our discussion about fanfiction, we talked about the tropes of hurt comfort, how the feeling of catharsis is heightened when the suffering protagonist is cared for, and I'd say that's what's happening here. In all, I can't think of any aspect of Caleb's narrative effect that doesn't in some way help Jude to suffer or enhance the catharsis that comes from it. But Caleb is one of Jude's abusers. What about a completely unrelated plot thread? What about JB's painting career? What's the payoff of the arc that starts with JB working hard to become an artist and ends with his successful exhibitions? He insults Jude, reminding him that even his close friends can be awful to him, though none other than JB ever are. There's the embarrassment Jude feels when JB exhibits the painting of him without him knowing. There's JB hitting on Jude right at the end, after William's death, only making Jude feel worse. In short, again, I can't think of a single action JB takes in the story that doesn't in some way serve Jude's suffering. In fact, I can't think of anything in the book that doesn't serve that suffering and the resultant catharsis. Except one. What if I told you, here comes that final act twist, or I guess the however long this video we are through twist. Going by the definition above, I don't think A Little Life counts as trauma porn. Imagine a porn film. There's the hunky pizza guy, there's nakedness, there's bumping uglies and orgasms, and you're having a good time with it. You're feeling the intended sexual gratification. I've never felt less sexy than I do right now. But then, right at the very end, the pizza guy turns to the camera and says, "Boy, I love having premarital sex, and I get to do that because I reject the teachings of the Catholic Church." Suddenly, that porno isn't a porno anymore. It's a political manifesto film that uses all the elements of a porno to convey a message. Your enjoyment of the sexy stuff was necessary to build to the larger, true point of the film, and it doesn't matter that it's only in the last line that this true meaning was revealed. It's not a porno anymore. 99% of A Little Life is trauma porn. It's geared towards making you feel that sadness and catharsis. But the last 1% uses that feeling to make a point. In the end, Yanagihara has something to say. It's this message that stops the book from being trauma porn, and it's this message that makes the book disgusting. Part 6. The meaning of A Little Life. In order to understand what A Little Life is really about, we need to talk about Hanya Yanagihara. She said some pretty interesting things in interviews. In a 2015 interview with Electric Literature, she said, quote, "I don't believe in it. Talk therapy, I should specify. Myself. One of the things that makes me most suspicious about the field is its insistence that life is always the answer. Every other medical specialty devoted to the care of the seriously ill recognizes that at some point, the doctor's job is to help the patient die, that there are points at which death is preferable to life, but psychology and psychiatry insists that life is the meaning of life. I also think there's a point at which it becomes too late to help some people, that there's a time past which the damage has calcified so completely that there's no undoing it." I'll remind you, she's pretty open about having done no research into the realities of mental health issues.
In terms of the pedophilia, I didn't do any research, and you sort of don't have to.
What kind of research did you look into for cutting, and cutting as a coping mechanism?
None. And, I was telling my friend who's here that I found out after, it is something mostly women do, and women do it because it's the internalization of rage.
This would be something if Yanagihara herself had a history of therapy, but again, she's pretty open about the fact she doesn't.
Memory is never something that, I mean, I've never been to therapy, but...
Although, interestingly, in a 2022 interview with The Guardian, she again spoke about her experience with therapy. Quote, Yanagihara said she'd once been in therapy, but found it useless. She had come with a concrete question, not a request for an intrusive mental workup. I wanted advice, she told me, and they mostly refused to give it. A romantic friendship was in a difficult spot, and she wanted instructions for how to fall out of love. This tells us that, despite writing a novel that clearly disparages therapy and doubts its effectivity, she still sought out therapy for herself in the years after its publication. It also tells us that Yanagihara's view of talking therapy is pretty reductive. In her opinion, bad mental health is like your car breaking down. You can just drop your brain in the shop for a few days, and when you pick it up, it'll be fixed. It all comes together to show us just how flimsy Yanagihara's understanding of mental health is. Like I said before, I don't have a history of abuse, but I have been through more than my fair share of therapy. A close brush with suicide when I was a teenager put me through my first round of therapy with the NHS, a process which was slow and difficult. I was put on a series of different psychiatric drugs that ranged from ineffective to outright harmful. Anyone with a similar experience will know that there are few things worse than being put on the wrong psychiatric medication. I had hallucinations, I got worse and worse, and I wasn't in a state of mind where I could see what was happening and make reasonable choices. Therapy, which I was lucky enough to get within a few months, didn't help. My therapist was so overworked, I could only see her by phone once a fortnight. Even when we did talk, I didn't see any results. So I stopped. I gave up the idea. Therapy wasn't for me. I stopped medication. I found other ways to cope with the help of people close to me. But I hadn't dealt with any of the underlying problems, and it wasn't until my early 20s that I went back to therapy. I was working so I could afford private therapy, and I was ready to retry medication. I was lucky enough to find a fantastic therapist and to find a drug that worked for me. Things got better, and now I'm able to look back at my patterns of thought when I needed therapy most and see how wrong they were. My experience is nowhere near to what you'd experience in the book. I grew up in a loving home with two parents who care about me, but I have been suicidal in the past, and reading about Yanagihara's opinion on therapy, mental health, and suicide struck a nerve. Like I mentioned before, Yanagihara holds the view that some people are simply too broken to continue living. She says, like people with terminal cancer or incurable disease, it's irresponsible to assume that everyone can be brought back to full health. In some cases, she says, it's best to let people die. Here's the problem with that, Miss Yanagihara. As much as physical health is a good analogy for mental health, it isn't perfect. My leg will heal in its cast no matter my opinion of how healthy I am. I don't have to work continuously to make my leg heal. Improving your mental health relies on your belief that things can and will get better. It's clear to me now that when I was at my lowest, my problems were not insurmountable, evidently because I did find ways to overcome them. I was lucky enough to have the help of close family and friends. But when I was in that place, I fully, deeply believed that I was incurable. Something was just wrong with me from birth, and no matter what I did, I would never be fixed. What might have happened if I didn't have some amazing, caring people in my life? What would I have done if I had just read A Little Life and seen myself in Jude? The message of the book, that some people are better off dead, is beyond irresponsible. It's dangerous, and above all, it's wrong. Therapy does work. Medication does work. Things can get better. How cold, how sick does Yanagihara have to be to believe that it's better to let people take their own lives than seek help? Even if you do believe that some people have gone through so much that healing is out of the question, why would you want that idea shared, especially among young people who almost certainly are not in that group, but may well believe themselves to be? The story of A Little Life is so contrived, so overwrought and forced to present a situation where the reader is forced to conclude that its protagonist should commit suicide. And to what end? To tell the world that the mentally ill aren't worth saving? Maybe that was the point. We live in a time when euthanasia on the grounds of mental health seems more and more legitimate, with Canada even going as far to enact legislation that would make this legal, though it's been delayed multiple times. Perhaps Yanagihara is in favour of such legislation, and wrote this book to support that idea. The fact that this book has been so popular among young people concerns me. Like I said, I can't imagine the effect the story might have had if I had read it when I was younger. The moral of the story is pretty clear. Here's a man who has suffered more than you, more than anyone ever has, and even managed to have an amazing career, to find love, to find family, but at the end of it all, it would have been better if he had ended things when he was young. Some people, this book says, are better off killing themselves. That's what this book was written for.